Hello everyone, and welcome to this webinar of the Palliative Care for People with Learning Disabilities Network. I'm Irene Taffri-Weine, and in the next hour we're going to think about people with learning disabilities and DNACPR. Now that's a really hot topic at the moment. Do not attempt cardiopulmonary resuscitation. It's really hot. It's clear from the huge numbers of people that have signed up. It's almost 2,500 people signed up to this webinar, which is a record. So it's clearly an important thing to think and talk about. So we'll talk through the complexities of DNACPR decisions, when they're appropriate and when they're absolutely not appropriate. But before we do that, let's just introduce this topic by looking at how it was reported on the BBC News last month, and also listening to two men with learning disabilities, Terry Barlett and Louis de la Rua, who are discussing DNACPR together. Let's start with that.
Now, England's care regulator, the Care Quality Commission, in a report to be published tomorrow, is expected to raise serious concerns about the use of Do Not Resuscitate orders during the pandemic. Families and charities say that the orders, which can deny people potentially life-saving care, have been wrongly placed on elderly and disabled people over the past year at unprecedented rates.
It really gives me sleepless nights to think that she was alone and she didn't have anyone with her. Soldier! Simon was just someone that had an absolute zest for life, loved being with her family, always smiling, always laughing.
Say hello, Mum. Mum's waiting for you to talk. Say hello, Mum.
At no point were we told that that had taken place. And had I been told, and certainly if my mum was aware that that had been put in place, we would have disputed that. And we would have said, we don't want that in place for Soane. That was one of the most blatant forms of discrimination, in black and white, on the paper, that I'd ever seen. I just couldn't comprehend how that can be cited as a reason for someone not to be resuscitated. That picture to me is her spirit, her happy, how vibrant she is, her smile. Soane's fate was predetermined. From the moment she went into hospital, felt like Soane was totally written off. She was dehumanized, and her life wasn't of value. Everyone was sort of like, not so. I can't tell you how much, we miss her.
How does it make you feel, the term "do not resuscitate"?
I think it feels sad that when someone's going, or say goodbyes to them, or whatever it is.
In other words, not long for the world.
Yeah.
That one, yeah.
And I think there's like angels flying over the skies, and
Right. Exactly, yeah. But I recently heard on the news once about when MenCap, when some of the NHS workers were not listening to some people with learning disabilities, like some MenCap. One person who has Down syndrome, he was told if he has COVID and his heart goes, he will not be resuscitated. And
God.
That sounded a bit wrong. And his dad did not like that. His dad did not like it at all.
That's really wrong.
It is, yeah. I mean, you can't just
you can't just say something to someone else and then they think, you know.
Exactly.
It's not good for other people to say them things in front of other people, though.
Yeah, especially doctors and nurses sometimes.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's true.
Yeah, if his dad says, I don't want my son to die, they have to do everything they can to save him.
Yeah, it's true, though. Yeah.
Oh, thank you, Terry and Louis and the group at Generate for allowing me to record your discussion about DNACPR. Now, this webinar has been remarkably tricky to prepare because the stakes are so high, and as you've already heard, the emotions that it evokes are so strong and often for very obvious and good reasons. And concerns about inappropriate DNACPR are valid and they're real, and we want to look at that. We want to understand what we can all do to make sure that people with learning disabilities get equitable treatment, the right treatment at the end of their lives, and that may include CPR. But it may also include being protected from CPR and being protected from people jumping up and down your chest when you're dying. So that means that we have to understand what CPR is and what it means when doctors suggest a DNACPR order. And we need to be sure that the reasons for DNACPR are the right reasons. And having a learning disability, as we saw in the news report, is never the right reason. That should never be given as a reason. So let's look at today's speakers. We've got quite a brilliant lineup here, and we will try and pick up some of the things that they're saying afterwards in the Q&A. Claude Regnar and Catherine Mannix are able to stay. Catherine won't be able to stay till the end, only for the first half an hour, but Claude will be here for the Q&A afterwards. So as always, you can put your comments, your questions, your experiences in the Q&A box. We'll try and pick them up during our discussion at the end of the webinar. There's various people here behind the scenes live helping to monitor that. And we've also got Gemma Allen, the chair of our network, as usual, live tweeting. So I know that many of you are Twitterers and don't hold back. And as usual, we will end on a musical note. And before we start listening to the speakers, though, it's just quick. I just wanted to put up a couple of recent documents in the UK, just for you to note those and have a look at them. So the CQC, the Care Quality Commission, looked at people's experiences of DNACPR decisions during the pandemic, and that was what the newsreader was referring to earlier. And they are just documenting a lot of good experiences, but also examples where it completely came out of the blue and people were quite distressed by the DNACPR decision. And you may also have heard of RESPECT on the next slide, which is a process of personalised advanced decision making about clinical care and treatment in an emergency, which is then recorded, and that's being rolled out across the country. It's wider and probably more useful than recording this DNACPR documents. And we may be able to pick that up a bit later in the Q&A, but if we have time. But if not, then just have a look at that, because it's really quite a useful thing to know about. But now let's just listen to the experiences of two people who work in learning disability services. Maureen Nerean works in a learning disability service in Ireland, supporting people when they go into hospital. And Sharon Prowse is the senior manager of a learning disability service in England. And I'm very grateful to them for telling us the experiences and the stories of, what happened when they were, their experiences with DNACPR. So let's listen to them first.
I had a lady basically, and she was admitted for pain. She's a lady in her 40s, early 40s, quadriplegic cerebral palsy, minimal verbal communication, but could communicate her needs, has a moderate understanding of things that happen, doesn't like going into hospital or anything clinical, and is supported in what we would call a social care unit, so no nurse, not requiring any nursing supports. Then so she went into hospital for some pain, for a review of pain in, I can't remember whether it was her ankle or her arm, but it just wasn't resolving. So she went to ED and she was admitted. So she was admitted, and then they found there was a level of infection, so they were treating that. And I would work predominantly Monday to Friday. So on the Friday morning, I went in, saw her, spoke to the team as I thought, and headed off home. And then on the Monday morning, I came into work to get my weekend report from anybody who is in hospital, and the person, her head of unit who works with her all the time, contacted me and said that she had been made DNR on Friday evening. And I was like, okay, what's after happening? My understanding of anybody requiring do not resuscitate was that they'd become acutely unwell, possibly with something like sepsis, and that, you know, that accessing higher levels of care like HDU and ICU wouldn't benefit her in the long term. And that had always been my experience. So when I went in, I went straight into the hospital to try and see her, and there she was in the bed, looking quite well in comparison to what I thought was happening with her. And I spoke to the nurse, and the nurse said, no, she's doing okay, she's still on her IV antibiotics. So I was very confused as to why somebody had made a decision in regards to a DNR. They had spoken to her family, and her family had done, well, the doctors feel that this is the right thing for her. So then so there was no acute illness there. So I wasn't worried that they were suddenly going to, you know, kind of, she was going to pass away or anything. But I contacted the team, and I linked with them, and I said, look, I'm trying to get to the bottom of why a DNR was put in place. The consultant reviewed her on Friday evening, and it basically, I said, this lady goes, you know, she has a social life. She's here in hospital. She doesn't have her own wheelchair. So what you see is somebody with spastic quadriplegia who can't communicate, but she has a quality of life outside of here. Is her illness so acute? What's the, you know, I suppose I was trying to ascertain what was going on. And the conversation, and this was with the senior house officer. So, and how basically what I got back from her was that they didn't fully understand that she had a quality of life, that she goes out for coffees, and that she goes out for her own social life, that she's not acutely unwell. As this was her first hospital admission in many years. And she kind of went, oh, well, we weren't really aware of that. So I was like, well, I'd like you to bring this up with the consultant and, you know, come back to me. But there was no question to us as to, well, what would she normally like? What would her will and preference be? We knew that she understood to a certain extent what was going on, but she couldn't communicate that. On that particular time, I really do feel that it was a decision made by looking at the person in the bed. This person with her spasms, her severe, you know, they put an NG down, it came out because her spasms and her arms, the way they move, meant that the NG was pulled out accidentally. We were told that it was behaviour, and some of it possibly could be, but if somebody hasn't explained to somebody what something's for properly, that I do think that there is a risk that somebody will pull it out, either in confusion or because of the natural way their body works. But for me, definitely, I feel out of all the situations I've been in, that was definitely about the disability that person had, and that if they went into cardiac arrest, that they made the decision that her quality of life wasn't worth giving. And I wouldn't, that is the only one in many years that I've seen that, thankfully.
Hello, my name's Sharon Prowse. I'm a senior manager for a charity called Freeways that supports adults with learning disabilities. I'm also a member of the Strategic Advisory Group for the PCPLD. I'd like to talk to you today about a lady that received a DNAR inappropriately whilst in hospital. The lady that we support, she lives in a residential home, and she was taken to hospital due to stomach pain. The staff told the paramedics at the time that they believed her to be constipated. She was admitted to hospital, where the staff were told that her white count was down. Not knowing what this was, they asked, and they were told that it was potentially cancer. Tests were completed. Thankfully, she didn't have cancer. However, she was severely compacted. She was treated for this, and although staff had expressed concerns about her mobility, she was discharged from hospital. She was finding it difficult to wait there, and her bedroom is on the first floor in a house where there is no lift. 3 days later, after practically living in the lounge, she was readmitted into hospital. Due to not being able to wait there, she was very chesty and her breathing was quite laboured. It turned out that she had pneumonia. She was given the appropriate treatment to allow her to return home. On her return, and with the discharge note, the staff noticed that a DNAR had been placed on her notes. They made their manager aware, who contacted her senior manager. The manager and staff team were outraged that this had been placed on the notes, and with what seemed to be no communication with family or support staff. The manager contacted the lady's family, both her brother and her sister, and asked if they'd been consulted on this decision. The lady's brother had, who is also a GP, and although he said he didn't ultimately agree with it, he had gone along with it more as a professional courtesy. Her sister, however, was equally as outraged as the manager and the staff. The manager went directly to the doctor who had placed the DNAR into a note and asked why this had been put in place. They responded by saying it was done with consultation with others. The manager challenged this and told the doctor there had been no consultation with the people that are important to her and know her very well, i.e. her brother and her family and the support staff. The most shocking thing was that the doctor hadn't even consulted with the lady who was being treated. Again, the manager asked why it had been put in place and the reasons. The reasons? Her age, a lady in her 60s, and the fact that she had a learning disability. The decision had absolutely nothing to do with her health. I'm very glad to say that the doctor did indeed remove the DNAR, and it was most fortunate that we had a manager who wasn't afraid to challenge the doctor. And I would encourage people to challenge where someone has a DNAR placed on their records without a capacity assessment or best interest taking place, making sure that they involve the circle of support for that person, ultimately family and support staff. Thank you.
Well, something that happened I hadn't seen happen before was in the last year and a bit, was that somebody who gets an ambulance transfer from the hospital back to their residential unit, and attached to their discharge letters or notes was a little note saying this person is not for resuscitation. And it was actually a pre-prepared letter basically saying this person was not for resuscitation and it said that they had discussed it with the person. Now that this particular person would not be able to have that conversation with somebody. I received a call from the people who work with this person saying, what does this mean? We don't have this. Does this mean that she's not ever to go back into the hospital? But she has to, you know? And I said, no, leave it with me. And when I contacted the consultant under whom she was being cared for in the hospital, he said that that was a standard letter that was sent out to nursing homes. You see, they see us as a nursing home, and I'm forever saying, no, we're not nursing home. And I said, well, you haven't discussed this with her. You can't write in something that you've discussed this with this person when you haven't. If a decision has been made, we're open to that. That's okay, but you need to communicate with us properly and have the right supports in place. Because if somebody is not for resuscitation and not for re-entry into hospital, for me, that means they're under palliative care. And I don't mind that. I think, you know, palliation is part of life. Supporting somebody towards a comfortable and safe and harmonious death is part of what we do. But if we need to make sure that those supports are there and the proper ones there, and a palliative care consultant has been involved and the family has been involved. Now, this is me being anecdotal, so it may not be anything, but it just shows you that a doctor can be asked to write a note for the ambulance men. So if somebody has a cardiac arrest, which obviously is very unlikely in the 20 minutes that they might be going home, but that it's still written about somebody's life.
Well, thank you both, Maureen and Sharon. It's really helpful for us to hear those kind of experiences. And let's think about that a little bit more, because the term do not resuscitate can be really confusing. As we've heard, Maureen's staff team was confused. They thought it might mean that people wouldn't even be taken to hospital. And sometimes hospital staff themselves can also get confused about this. So let's listen to Baroness Elora Finlay. She is a palliative care consultant and the chair of the National Mental Capacity Forum. And this is an extract from a talk she gave for us for a webinar in October, and we'll put the full link to that webinar in the Q&A. But in this extract, she's addressing exactly that, the dangers of using terms that might be confusing and the importance of being clear about what you actually mean. So thank you, Elora, for letting us listen to you again.
The terribly dangerous thing is that phrase, do not resuscitate, which means don't do anything, abandon everything, when actually it's a shortcut, a really dangerous shortcut, because it doesn't state where the boundaries are. It doesn't state this is how much we will do, and at this point we will accept that the disease process is going inevitably towards death, and we will accept natural death. You cannot say everybody in this nursing home is not for cardiopulmonary resuscitation, or everybody here is not for antibiotics if they become septic. Those, you cannot do that. Each decision must be made on the individual. And then for the individual, each decision must be based on the likelihood of them responding to an intervention. But just to say, do not resuscitate, well, what does that mean? What does that mean to the nurse who comes on duty? The patient's diabetic, they find them in a coma, somebody's written do not resuscitate. Does that mean that they know they're diabetic? Does that mean they don't do a blood sugar? Because if their blood sugar's low and you give them some glucagon or you give them some glucose, they'll wake up. You know, they'll be fine. But if you don't, they'll be dead. When somebody dies and you've got do not resuscitate written down, do you really mean don't do anything to bring them back from that near-death state they're in? Or do you mean we're not going to attempt CPR, which is the ultimate? If the person lacks capacity, but they, for that decision at that time, whatever the decision is, you must still involve them. So you must say, we're going to do this, but we're not going to do that. We will be treating you, but we won't do anything that would cause you pain or distress. So you need to explain it in very simple terms, but you still must involve the person. You can't just play God and make a decision over their head, but you must be quite specific as to what the decision is and why you're making it, and write it down so that you're thinking through, you're planning ahead for all the likely eventualities that you can see. The first question is, what do you mean by resuscitation? What treatment are you asking that you would or would not give? So force clarity. The next question is, do you mean cardiopulmonary resuscitation? Do you mean CPR only in the event that her heart stops and she has a reversible rhythm, that you would not try to reverse it? That really pins people down. So I would like every parent to feel empowered to say, what do you mean by resuscitation? I want everything done to treat my daughter or son or whoever it is, if that's what they feel, or they may say, we've agreed that at this point we wouldn't do any more. And then the next question is it cardiopulmonary resuscitation with external cardiac massage and cardioversion if their heart stops? And really pinning that down.
Thanks again, Elora. And as I said, we'll put the full link to that whole talk in the Q&A. We need to have a much clearer understanding about why doctors issue DNACPR orders and what that means, when it might be appropriate and when we might actually prefer it, because we want to be protected from inappropriate DNACPR, but we also want to be protected from inappropriate CPR. So I'm delighted to welcome back Dr. Catherine Mannix, who is going to help us with this. Catherine is a retired consultant in palliative medicine, and she's as busy as ever. She is an author and has written a hugely successful book, With the End in Mind, and she's on a mission to help people understand ordinary dying. And during the pandemic, Catherine has been helping hospital staff to cope with the enormously challenging task of supporting patients and families, at the end of life who are dying, and talking to families about what's happening, and that includes DNA CPR decisions. So thank you, Catherine, for sharing your wisdom with us. Catherine, thank you so much for joining this conversation. Maybe we can just start, because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about what CPR actually is and what it isn't. And could you start by that, just explaining?
Yeah, oh, thanks for inviting me. It's lovely to be supporting you again. So CPR, gosh, what a vexed question it's become. So it stands for Cardiopulmonary Resuscitation. So it's about heart and lungs. And it's a first aid procedure that might help to save a person's life if they're well enough, their body is well enough for their life to be saved, and if suddenly and unexpectedly either their heart stops or their breathing stops, or both, where you might be able to rescue them and get them to hospital for treatment that would restart their heart and restart their breathing. And we don't know the exact numbers for success, but we know that it's not universally successful, and that in fact it's unsuccessful more often than it's successful. But it really depends on the reason that it's happened to somebody.
So that means then, presumably, that it really only works, as a holding measure, if the rest of your body is still working well enough to survive.
Yeah. That's absolutely right. So if we just think about the circumstances in which people's hearts might stop, so it's one of two ways round, that your body is either well or it's not so sick that it can't get better again, and then your heart stops first. CPR is the holding procedure that may enable the doctors to restart your heart. The other circumstance in which people's heart stops, though, is in the process of ordinary dying, when a person's body is so unwell that they're reaching the end of their life, and usually we are anticipating that they're reaching the end of their life. So that might be that they've had an illness that's been going on for quite a long time, gradually making them more and more poorly, or it might be that they suddenly caught an illness that there isn't a treatment for. So COVID is a really good example of that, where we're looking after them the best that we possibly can, but they're still getting more and more poorly, and eventually we realise we're not going to be able to save their life, and sometime in the next hours or days we anticipate that they will die. Now, when we're dying, what happens is that gradually our heart doesn't beat so hard, and the blood pressure isn't as strong, and the oxygen doesn't get around the body as well. So everything starts to suffer. The kidneys don't work so well, the liver doesn't work so well, breathing's not so great, the blood supply to the brain isn't very good, and gradually everything slows down until the person eventually is just deeply unconscious, and eventually there are pauses in their breathing, and then very gently their breathing will stop. And then a few minutes after that, because it's not getting an oxygen supply anymore, the heart will stop beating. So in ordinary dying, instead of the heart stopping first, the heart, in fact, is the very last thing to stop. And CPR is not in any way going to be a treatment under those circumstances. So it's working out what's happening to the person that helps us to know whether CPR even has a chance of being the right treatment or whether it's just not appropriate at all. Let's think about what CPR is. If somebody's going to have CPR, what do we actually do to them? Well, what we've got to do is press on their chest hard enough that we squeeze their lungs and their heart really, really tight. So we press on the chest bone, and the person needs to be lying down, and you're pressing really deeply on the chest bone. And what that's doing is squeezing the heart, which is squeezing the blood around the circulation. And all of us who've done CPR in hospitals have felt people's ribs crack or sternum, breastbone crack. It's quite an aggressive thing to do. So I would only want somebody to do something like that to me if it was really, really likely to help me. And certainly that's not the way I envisage my dying moments. I want my family around the bed, not a resuscitation team around the bed. So one of the things when we're talking to people about dying is approaching is to start to line up what will be the treatments that are important for this person. And what would be the other treatments that sometimes get offered, but actually we should protect that person from under these circumstances. So if a person is reaching the end of their life, and let's say COVID is a really good example, we might want to think about what would be the drugs we would give to make sure that somebody didn't feel all those flu-y symptoms, didn't feel all of that pain, didn't feel that sense of breathlessness. So those are the treatments you would want somebody to have. But you would also know that if they became so sick that they were on the brink of death, that actually CPR wouldn't be going to revive them and save them because their whole body has been racked by this virus disease of COVID. So now we would put a DNACPR statement in that person's notes, because what we want to do is protect them from having that aggressive but not helpful treatment as they're dying. Now, I might make a phone call to a person's family to explain that this person they love is dying, and I'm really sorry to have to break that news over the phone. That's a terrible thing to have to do. I might not actually go into the detail of saying, and as they're dying, we will not do not necessary treatments. So the family might discover afterwards that I've put a do not attempt CPR note in their notes, simply to confirm that this is somebody who's dying and we know we can't reverse it. And that is regardless of whether the person is a person with a learning disability or not. Somebody who's inevitably dying needs to be protected from intrusive, aggressive, bone-breaking CPR because it isn't going to help them. Somebody who's not inevitably dying maybe could benefit from the treatment. Well, we all have a right to say, if you want to offer me that treatment, I'll accept it. And we also have the right to say, if you want to offer me that treatment, I don't want it anyway. So for a person with a learning disability, we need to find out whether this is a treatment they would or would not accept. Because they might not have capacity to have that whole conversation and make that decision alone, we want to have that conversation with them, with their supporters, with their advocates, and reach what's called a best interests decision. And I know somebody's talking about best interests decisions part of this webinar. The law says we need to tell the family we won't be attempting CPR because it won't work. In order that the next shift that comes in knows that we've realised it won't work, there'll be a DNACPR notice in the notes. It's not a form that a patient signs consent for, a family signs consent for. It's a medical decision form, almost like a prescription form, really. Or it's a decision that's made in an emergency, and then the family must be informed afterwards that that decision was put in place. So it should never be a secret, I think, is the really important thing. And sometimes there's a lot of information to communicate in a very short amount of time with people who are really, really distressed. Sometimes in trying to help them to be less distressed, we don't tell them everything that's on the list. we're distressed too, we're doing our best, we get it wrong. And sometimes I think that people just don't understand the law properly and don't tell because they don't realise that they must tell. But it's not always about people keeping secrets. Sometimes it's just about the really, really difficult circumstances when CPR is being discussed because we're talking about the end of somebody's life.
What sort of advice would you then give to families like the ones we've heard about who are really concerned about having found that in the notes with the DNACPR without knowing anything about it beforehand and being really anxious that that was made simply because the person had a learning disability?
Yeah. And if I was that family, I would have that same anxiety and misgiving. But I think anybody who's got an anxiety about it afterwards needs to ask to talk to the team that was making those decisions. Because what we need to do is to understand what was going through their minds, don't we? That actually, if I was the parent or the sister of a person with a learning disability who's just died, and there was a DNACPR notice in their notes and I wasn't told about it, well, if I was their advocate, if I would have a right to know and you have not respected my right to know, I would want to know on what grounds you made that decision. Now, you might have made that decision because by the time my sister got to you, she was so close to death that all you could do was ease her symptoms as she died and make sure she wasn't uncomfortable and distressed. And actually, for me to know that and to know that the decision not to use CPR was because it was just not appropriate. But I also want to challenge, and I know families feel this all the time, just to be sure that you didn't make an assumption about my sister, that actually because she has a learning disability, she somehow has a quality of life that isn't important to her. And you didn't ask me and you didn't ask our parents about my sister's quality of life as she lives it. So how could you make that decision? So I think it is really important that we're not left in bereavement with all sorts of questions about why the decisions were made. I think that we're getting better in healthcare at talking about these things. And actually, one of the ways that we can help people to do better is to hold them accountable when they've got it wrong and help them to see what it was that they missed. And that can't ever bring our beloved person back, but it can help them to be a person who makes better judgments and fewer assumptions in the future for other people's relatives.
Thank you very much for taking the time to help us think about these things. Thanks, Catherine.
Thank you.
Thanks again, Catherine. That was so useful to help us understand what CPR actually is and why you might not want it. Now, DNACPR decisions are usually part of advanced care planning. And if you lack capacity to make decisions, then what that requires is a best interest decision. And we thought it'd be really helpful to think about the requirements with regard to medical decision making if people lack capacity. So I'm delighted to have Dr. Claude Regnard with us. He's an expert on mental capacity and decision making with people with learning disabilities. And he's actually been part of the PCPLD network from the beginning in 1998. So it's really lovely to have you with us, Claude. You may remember him from our November webinar, and he spoke about the DISDAT tool, the Disability Distress Assessment tool. And if you've missed that, then do go back. It's on our YouTube channel. Now, do bear in mind that mental capacity laws vary across countries. And here we're talking about England and Wales. And I know that many of you watching this webinar are based in other countries with other laws. But I think you will find that the principles that Claude will talk about, the principles behind best interest decisions, are useful to all of us, wherever you are. A slightly longer version of this talk that he's going to give us is available on our YouTube channel, where he goes into best interest decisions in a little bit more detail. Thank you, Claude, and welcome back.
Hello, I'm Claude Regnard, and for the last 40 years I've worked in hospices and hospitals helping to care for people with life-threatening and life-limiting illness. I'm going to look at the Mental Capacity Act, which governs how we make decisions, both in people with capacity and those who lack capacity. The MCA, as it's often called, covers England and Wales. The equivalent in Scotland is the Adults with Incapacity Act. I'm going to look at two aspects of the MCA, that's capacity and best interests. And a longer, slightly longer version of this will be available through the PCPLD and on YouTube. So you can look that up if you want more details, particularly on best interests. Now, there are three guiding principles. First, think about capacity in all situations, but start by assuming that an individual has capacity. Just because somebody looks or acts differently doesn't mean to say that they lack capacity. Secondly, capacity is specific to the decision being made, so you can have capacity for one decision, but not for another. And thirdly, best interests isn't simply someone's opinion. It's not general guidance. It's a checklist required by law. There are three principles that guide what we should do. Firstly, if there's no suspicion of an impairment or disturbance of mind or brain and a decision is needed, you must assume the individual has capacity and ask them for consent in order to be treated or cared for. Secondly, if you suspect an impairment or disturbance of mind or brain and a decision is needed, you must test the individual's capacity for that decision. Now, you can't test capacity without a decision being needed. If several decisions are needed, then capacity will need to be tested for each one. In some situations, verbal agreement can be sufficient for simple things like accepting a cup of tea, but bear in mind that agreement is not the same as consent. Thirdly, if it is clear that capacity is lacking for this decision, then you must follow the best interests checklist. And that's it. It's simple, isn't it? Unfortunately, many healthcare professionals are still not getting this right, particularly best interests. So I'm going to just look at this in a little more detail. First of all, testing capacity. Can the individual understand the information? This assumes that the information has been presented to them in a way that they can understand. Secondly, can they remember the information long enough to be able to weigh it up? Thirdly, can they weigh up the information? And in other words, can they balance the pros and cons of what is being proposed? And finally, can they communicate their decision? Now, this assumes that everything has been done to enable them to communicate. If the answer is no to any of these, then they lack capacity, and the outcome of this must be documented. Now, best interests only applies to individuals who lack capacity. It's not what the carer thinks is best. It is a checklist required by law to estimate what the individual would have wanted. Now, these are the minimum required by the Mental Capacity Act. Now, on the other longer video, it goes through in more detail, but I'm just going to list them. Have we consulted with others? Have we avoided making assumptions? It's very important that we document that we've done that. Could capacity return in time for a decision? They may just have a temporary problem that can be fixed, but if there's time to wait for the capacity return, then you could wait. Have we included the individual? Just because they lack capacity doesn't mean to say that they can't express an opinion. We're not bound by the decision, but we are bound to take it into account. For life-sustaining treatment, have we ensured that no one is motivated by a desire for their death? For example, they may have just won the lottery and somebody is wanting the money. Unlikely, but it's important that it's checked. 6, have past wishes and feelings, beliefs and values been taken into account? Have they written something down? Have they said something to others? 7, have we considered the least restrictive option for the individual? 8, have we considered the emotional bonds that somebody may have? And lastly, what decision would the individual have made in their best interest? And as I say, in the longer version, this is available in more detail. But let's look at the last one. What decision would the individual have made if they had capacity? This is about walking in their shoes. It's not what decision we think is right. It's not our personal opinions. It's not our view of their quality of life. Best interest is an estimate of the individual's viewpoint, balancing the benefits and harms of the proposed care option. It's about empowering the individual. Thank you.
So these were really thought-provoking and wonderful presentations and talks, and we have so many questions and comments pouring into the Q&A box. So we don't have time for all of them. I'm delighted that both Claude and actually Catherine Mannix is also still here, so we can discuss it with both of them. But the first one I want to pick up is, there is clearly a difficulty in sort of knowing whether a CPR order, a DNA CPR order is there because it wouldn't work anyway, because the person is dying. That was what Catherine was talking about. Or whether it is, because of other reasons, because where unconscious bias comes in. I'm just going to read out a comment from somebody called Tricia Handley, who says, the rationale for having that initial discussion on DNA CPR in the absence of a life-threatening illness is often where I feel unconscious bias comes in. And I just wonder whether I can pick that with you, Claude, because I know you've done a lot of thinking about that unconscious bias and making sure it's not discriminatory and it's the right reasons. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest problems we have is this phrase best interests. It's probably the most abused phrase in clinical care because everybody thinks they act in an individual's best interests. Now, what people are often confusing is acting in best interests, which actually is part of the Mental Capacity Act and is a clear checklist that is required. And they're confusing that with doing your professional best. That is something that all health professionals have to do, but they're not the same thing. And clearly, if somebody has capacity, then you have to ask them, and that's very clear. There is a different situation where somebody is clearly dying and where the treatment you would like to give, which might be CPR, simply could never work. No matter how much you would like it to, it would never work. And that's an issue of breaking difficult news. That's about communication. That's not about consent. But the problem is that this issue of best interest, when it's used badly, the phrase, and not in terms of the Mental Capacity Act, is that it's very open to unconscious bias. And people can look at individuals and make assumptions, and particularly about quality of life. And we're terrible about judging other people's quality of life. And they make judgments and say, oh, it wouldn't be worth it. And the problem we have is that CPR success varies from 0, when somebody is dying and it cannot work, to nearly 100%. Because, for example, some of you out there will be looking after children and young people with neurodegenerative disorders and other disabilities. And one of the common problems they have is respiratory arrest. That requires CPR. But in fact, it's often a partial CPR where you help them breathe for a little while, and actually the success rate is very high. In between that range, there's a whole variety of success rates. And one of the challenges is looking at each individual as a person and saying, actually, is there a possibility if it could work? If it could work, then you're looking at a consent process if they have capacity, or best interests.
So thanks, Claude. And actually, can I pick that up with you as well, Catherine? Because some of the questions that have been raised in the Q&A are around, I suppose, really about whose decision is it? Is it families having to consent to this? Or is it a medical decision that actually families have to be informed about? So whose responsibility is that? And also one of the questions of somebody called Ian Penfold, who says, were you saying that we might as well not bother with CPR? How do you know it won't work before you try it? So could you just address some of those concerns that people genuinely have?
Okay, thanks. Those are really important questions. So I hope I can remember them all. You might need to prompt me. So the first thing is that all of these are we're talking about a treatment, and the decision to offer a treatment to somebody is a medical decision. So if you have a very bad sore throat, take a really simple example, and your GP looks in your throat and says, you've got a really bad bacterial infection in your throat, and I'm going to offer you antibiotics for that. And you can say, thank you, doctor. Yes, I'd like to take antibiotics, or I don't believe in antibiotics, doctor. I'll just go away and take throat lozenges and wait for it to get better. So we have the right to turn down treatments that are offered. But if the doctor looks in your throat and says, actually, you've got a really bad viral sore throat, so just go home, take paracetamols, drink lots of fluids, look after yourself. You're going to feel rotten. I'm so sorry, but I don't have a treatment that will help. And you say, well, doctor, last time you gave me antibiotics, I want antibiotics again. Now, antibiotics won't work for a virus, as we've learned through COVID. So we don't have a right to demand a treatment. We only have a right to refuse a treatment that's offered. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that if we are offered some quite complicated treatments like operations, then we go through a very formal process of consenting somebody, saying, I've just explained to this person what this complicated operation is about and the risks of the anaesthetic and everything else, and they have agreed to accept those risks. They want to have the treatment, and we've signed a consent form. Or we might have to go through the process that Claude was just describing, that this person with learning disability wants their sore hip to be better. They would really like to be able to walk more comfortably, and the operation that could help them for that is a hip replacement. So now we're going to make a decision by talking to each other, talking to the patient, talking to the patient's advocates, and following the step-by-step process as required by law of the best interest decision making to decide that the risks of the anaesthetic and the risk of the operation itself are worth the benefit that the person will get, and that they would be willing to do that to our best knowledge. So now, rather than the person consenting, a best interests process is reaching the decision that this is an acceptable, sensible treatment for this person's sore leg. So it's a medical decision to offer a treatment, and then it's a personal decision or a best interests decision to agree to accept the treatment. And I'm looking at Claude here to just make sure he's nodding his head in case I'm, mucking this up. So we're not asking families to consent. We're informing families that the treatment is not going to be offered, and we should be able to say to them, it's not going to be offered for these very particular reasons. So there may be a person who now has lack of mental capacity, but previously had capacity to say, I would hate that idea of cardiopulmonary resuscitation. I don't want that ever to happen to me. I'm going to write down my wish that even if I should be so sick that I would die without it, I don't want to have CPR. So that's called an advanced decision to refuse treatment. And if it's been written properly, signed, dated, been witnessed, and the person had capacity to make that decision at the time, then for the rest of their life, unless anything else changes, that advanced decision to refuse treatment pertains, and nobody can do the treatment they've refused without actually committing a crime, the crime of battery in English and Welsh law. So that's the first thing. People can say no. Well, why might somebody say no? Well, one of the difficulties is that CPR is a spectrum of treatments from, as Claude said, at one end, somebody stopped breathing, and by very gently helping them, putting a mask on, squeezing air in and out, they may very well recover from something that's happened and get better again. And I can't imagine circumstances where it wouldn't be in somebody's best interests to have a go at that. At the other end is somebody who's already known to be very sick, who's likely to be going to die from this illness. We know CPR won't actually save their life at that point, but it will certainly interfere with their dying. And what we're talking about then is protecting them from that intrusion towards the end of their life. It won't work. The doctors know that it's not going to work because it's not a treatment for dying. So this is a discussion to have with the family in order to give them the information that that's the decision. We're not asking them to consent to it.
Thanks, Catherine. And I mean, we're running out of time, but I just want to ask you one further quick question, either of you. I don't know who wants to answer it, but the question is, several people have asked, you know, families possibly actually, how do we ascertain, how do we know whether a DNACPR order has placed on my family members, my loved ones' notes? What can do they just ask the doctors? How can they find out whether that's happened? Because there are some real concerns there that people have these on their notes before they're dying, when they're not, you know, when they're not having a life-threatening condition. So I see you nodding, Claude. Do you want to quickly answer that before we finish?
Yes, I mean, you know, relatives and carers and family have a right to be asking that, and especially if they're already, you know, acting on behalf of the individual. They have every right to check that out. They should have been, it should have been involved in the conversation. So that should already have happened. So if they didn't know and it's already happened, then they weren't included in the conversation. So there is already a problem that's arising there. And what I was going to say, one quick thing is that there is in all health services an assumption in favour of treatment. That exists right across the board. The problem here is that that assumption in favour of treatment has not always been transferred to individuals with a disability. And that's where the problem has arisen. And that's where unconscious bias has sometimes come in. And it should be there, but the assumption in favour of treatment does exist. What we need to make sure is that that assumption is transferred to somebody with any disability. And that people, if they have to, if they feel that that is a problem, they work back from that assumption and have very good reasons why it shouldn't be enacted.
Thank you so much, and I'm really sorry we're going to have to leave it there. We've already gone over the time that we'd allocated to this, but there is so much to discuss, and I do hope that you're keeping those discussions going. But let me finish there for now by saying a huge thank you to all my speakers. Claude Regnard, Catherine Mannix, Laura Finlay, Maureen Nerian, Sharon Prowse, Terry Barnett and Louis de la Rua. You know, such a huge range of experiences and knowledge and food for thought. The full webinar recording will be premiered on YouTube this evening, and already on YouTube is that longer version of Dr. Regnard's talk. Now, I always have to say this, please remember we are a charity with no source of income, so I'm going to pass the hat around again. To keep the webinars going, we really do rely on you and your donations, and you can donate by text or go to our website. And now you can also nominate us as your chosen charity on Amazon Smile, so you can shop in the lovely knowledge that you're raising money for us at the same time. There's a number of announcements, so just another couple of minutes if you can stay for that, that would be helpful. But for all of these announcements, please go to our website for more details. There's not going to be a webinar in May, but we are already working on the June webinar linked to Learning Disability Awareness Week, and that will be planned and presented entirely by people with learning disabilities. And I think that will be amazing and absolutely worth signing up for, and the sign-up link should be available shortly. We've opened nominations for the Linda Meckenhill Awards. And that recognises excellent in end-of-life and bereavement support for people with learning disabilities. And we have many more categories than usual this year because it's been such an extraordinary year. So do have a look and think of nominating someone or a team or an organisation to get them the recognition that they deserve. We've also opened a call for abstracts for our annual conference, and that will be held on the 16th of September. Again, if you go to our website, you will find more details, and do think of joining us for that conference. And finally, just to say that the PCPLD network is currently looking for people with learning disabilities specifically to join our specialist advisory group. And we have some easy read information about this. So do email us if you know of anyone who might be interested, and we can pick that up with you. So that's quite enough announcement. We've reached the 1:30 mark in terms of time. So thank you again for taking this hour to think together about DNACPR. And the discussions really, as we can see from all the Q&A, they're not finished. but I hope it's helped in some way to help the conversation going, to help you thinking about this really challenging issues. And finally, as always, let's end on a musical note. Here are the King's Singers and the musicians from the Soundabout Inclusive Choir, the Mixed Up Chorus and the Sing for Freedom Choir, with a song that was released last month to mark UN Zero Discrimination Day. And we thought it would be really appropriate to end with that particular song.
Like the word to sing in perfect harmony.
I'd like to build the world a hug and furnish it with love. Grow apple trees and honey bees and snow white turtle doves. I'd like to teach the world to sing in perfect harmony. I'd like to hold it in my arms and keep it company. I'd like to see the world for once all standing hand in hand and feel that ripple through the hills for peace through wonderland. That's the song I'd like to hear. Sing it and embellish it. That's the song that's let the world sing today, sing today, the world sing today, let it sing today.
Je voudrais apprendre au monde son frère en anglais parfait.
Oyo Nzembo Nazoyoka.
Chcę nauczyć cały świat śpiewać w dokładnej harmonii.
Thank you very much. You should have seen us behind the scenes going all like this. That put a smile on our faces, and that's important because having spent such a challenging hour. Thank you all very much and see you all again on the 8th of June. Bye-bye.